Hello, welcome to today's interview where we'll be focusing on Spain. With data released today showing a surprising drop in unemployment, the lowest since 2011, Spain is now one of the fastest growing countries in a struggling Euro region. To discuss the extent of Spain's growth further, I am joined by Nick Greenwood from AFI based in Madrid. Welcome to the show. Nick, what do the unemployment figures mean for the economy?
Well, I think these are a sign of good news for the economy as a whole. As you say, unemployment fell to 23.7%, which is the first time below 24% since 2011. Employment also rose by about 150,000, and that's equivalent to year-on-year growth of about 1.6%. So it's a sign that Spain's recovery is continuing. It's a slightly slower pace of employment growth than we saw in the previous quarter, but nonetheless a positive indication. I think we still need to keep an eye on it, though, in the sense that a large proportion of the jobs that were created were on temporary contracts. So the risk is that they could be reversed should the economy start to slow down. I think it's also important to bear in mind that Spain still has an unemployment of around about 5.5 million, and this means that even though we've seen 500,000 come off that figure over the last 12 months, not all of that has been due to new job creation. Some of that has been due to people falling off the active labour market, essentially disengaging a large proportion of foreigners. I think where there are some good signs in the data that was released today is in terms of the new jobs that are being created in terms of sectors. Until now, a lot of the job creation has been in services. Still the case, but we're starting to see a pickup in employment, for example, in industry and in construction, which is a sign that the economy is starting to broaden. So I think it's a good step forward, but still a long way to go.
Spain is pulling out of a 2-year recession. Do you agree with Miguel Matosian, Chief Executive Officer of the Credit Suisse Spanish division, who says that the trend in the country is very positive?
I think it's important to distinguish between two aspects, between the recent developments that we have seen which are related to the cyclical recovery, and then on the other hand, the longer-term growth prospects, which I think few economists would describe as very positive. I think what we have seen in terms of recent developments is a definite entry into a new phase. The Bank of Spain today released an early estimate of GDP in the last quarter at 0.5% quarter-on-quarter, and that means that we've now seen 5 consecutive quarters of growth in the Spanish economy, and in fact in the first half of this year Spain was the fastest growing economy amongst the large Eurozone economies. But we need to bear in mind that a lot of that is just a function of how badly the Spanish economy failed during the crisis. It experienced a larger decline in GDP than other large Eurozone economies, and therefore some of what we're seeing is a bounce back effect. Middle to high income families and households who basically withheld spending during the crisis starting to spend a bit more. It's the fact that labour forces and workforces have been quite reduced, and now as demand starts to pick up, they obviously have to take on more employees. But the reality is that that's not going to sustain the recovery in the longer term, and I think that's where we would be slightly more pessimistic. I think if you look at the latest IMF forecast, they predict that Spain's long-term growth might be around 2% per year, and there's a real question there as to whether that will be sufficient to bring down Spain's still high unemployment rate to a reasonable level and to allow the debt stocks to be digested. I think most economists think that unemployment could stay around 16-17% even when the economy is growing at a sort of steady state, which is obviously has significant economic and social implications.
What are your predictions for the recovery of the Spanish economy? What needs to be done to accelerate this?
So our forecasts are for Spain to grow by around about 1.3% this year, and then, all being well, closer to 2% next year. I think the big question mark around all forecasts concerning Spain and other Eurozone economies at the moment is what's going to happen in terms of growth in the rest of the world, and particularly in the core Eurozone economies such as Germany, France and Italy. There are signs, obviously, of a slowdown there, and that would affect Spain in terms of exports growth. They're about half of Spanish exports to Eurozone, and also would obviously have an impact on confidence and potentially lead to increased volatility in Spain's financing costs, all of which could lead to a slightly more negative scenario. I think in terms of kind of accelerating Spanish growth, what's really needed is a more solution at the European level, I think, rather than in Spain itself. So obviously we need ECB monetary policy to remain accommodative. We need an agreement on a sensible fiscal mix at the Eurozone level and more structural reforms. Spain can obviously influence that, but is not the key player there. I think what Spain can do and needs to do is to continue with its own structural reform programme. There was obviously a significant amount of progress under market pressure in the first part of the current legislature, and that's faded away a bit now, and there's still a lot of reform that could still be done, particularly in areas such as the labour market, professional services, judiciary. And the challenge, I think, really there is one of political risk. insofar as we're now almost 12 months away from general elections, and those general elections could well return a fragmented parliament, which would make it increasingly difficult to pass through the additional structural reform that Spain needs. So Spain's hands are tied a bit by the wider Eurozone picture and by its own political calendar.
Thank you for joining us, Nick. That wraps up today's interview. The Spanish general election will take place on the 20th of December. Goodbye.